Welcome to another episode of PACUPod. I'm Brittany, and joining me is Seth as we dive into the crucial clinical article titled Transfusion Practices in Traumatic Brain Injury. In this episode, we'll explore the study's objectives, innovative methodologies, and significant findings that shed light on optimal transfusion strategies for patients with traumatic brain injuries. We'll discuss how these insights can impact clinical practices and ultimately improve patient outcomes. Tune in to discover how you can apply these findings in your own practice.
Thanks, Brittany. It's great to be here and share insights from the latest studies impacting critical care. So let's kick things off with the background of this study. Managing anemia in TBI patients is incredibly challenging. Essentially, these patients often present with hemorrhagic injuries, and their management can be quite complex when it comes to transfusion strategies.
Absolutely, Seth. The major objective of this study was to evaluate different transfusion strategies and their effects on neurological recovery in TBI patients. It's a significant issue because traditionally, there's been a lot of variability in practice. Some clinicians are more conservative, while others tend to favor more aggressive transfusion thresholds.
Right, and this systematic review and meta-analysis aimed to synthesize existing data to provide clearer guidelines. They included studies with specific patient criteria and focused on various transfusion strategies. The primary endpoints examined were the differences in neurological outcomes, like the Glasgow Coma Scale scores after different transfusion protocols had been administered.
And the results were quite interesting. Initially, the study found no significant difference in neurological recovery between the different transfusion strategies. However, when they conducted a sensitivity analysis focusing on certain subsets of patients, they discovered some nuances that might indicate specific scenarios where transfusion could benefit neurologic outcomes.
Yes, and those insights really opened up a discussion. Although the overall findings suggested that transfusion strategies didn't greatly differ in terms of outcomes, there were indications that more frequent transfusions could lead to adverse effects like ARDS.
That's a vital point, Seth. It highlights the need for a careful balance. While we want to optimize the oxygen carrying capacity in these patients, transfusions can also exacerbate issues like transfusion-related acute lung injury.
Exactly. The clinical implications here are substantial. It compels us to question how transfusion thresholds should be approached in TBI management. For instance, do we adhere strictly to transfusion protocols, or do we adapt based on patient response and the dynamic clinical picture?
And this leads to the interactive element of our discussion. Listeners, how do you approach transfusion thresholds in TBI cases? Have you noticed a difference in outcomes based on the strategies you've employed? We'd love to hear your experiences.
Moving on to our next segment, let's discuss the study comparing magnesium sulfate.
Right. The study titled Magnesium Sulfate versus Lidocaine in Renal Colic focuses on pain management in acute renal colic, which is a significant challenge we encounter frequently in emergency settings. As we know, ineffective pain management can lead to poor patient experiences and complicate medical assessments.
Definitely. The objective here was to compare the efficacy of magnesium sulfate and lidocaine in providing pain relief. They conducted a randomized, double-blind trial, which is pivotal in ensuring that neither the participants nor the administrators knew which treatment was being given.
They included patients suffering from acute renal colic, and the primary endpoint focused on pain reduction. That kind of rigorous methodology is critical when considering the validity of the findings.
You bet. Now, the key findings were quite revealing. Magnesium sulfate provided only a modest reduction in pain compared to lidocaine, with the latter showing statistically insignificant benefit and notable adverse effects in some cases. It seems that magnesium sulfate has potential as an adjunct therapy rather than as a primary treatment.
And that brings up important clinical implications. In our real-world practice, how do we integrate magnesium sulfate into our pain management protocols for renal colic? Many providers are looking into multimodal analgesia strategies, aren't they?
Yeah, they really are. And speaking of experiences, listeners, what's your experience been with multimodal approaches in managing renal colic pain? Any preferred regimens that you've found effective?
Transitioning to our next study, which is particularly fascinating, we are covering out-of-hospital intranasal ketamine for trauma pain. Pain management before patients reach the hospital is so crucial and yet often overlooked.
Absolutely, Brittany. This study aimed to investigate whether intranasal ketamine administered by EMS providers could improve pain relief in a pre-hospital setting. Given how quickly injuries can escalate in trauma cases, effective pre-hospital pain management can significantly enhance patient care.
The methodology set up a randomized trial where EMS providers administered either ketamine or a placebo, which is a solid approach to assessing practicality on the field.
The unexpected results highlighted no significant difference in pain relief between the ketamine and placebo groups. And this raises a number of questions about how we're utilizing ketamine. Was the dosage adequate? Were the administration techniques varied among providers?
Exactly. It begs the question of whether adjustments are needed to truly harness ketamine's effectiveness in those acute settings. What about your take? Have you used ketamine in pre-hospital settings, Seth? What were your outcomes?
Unfortunately, I haven't had the chance yet, but I've heard mixed reviews from colleagues who've tried it. Some reported effective outcomes while others didn't notice a marked difference, which aligns with the findings of this study.
That's an essential aspect to consider, and it's a continuous conversation in emergency medicine. A brief summary of our discussion so far. When it comes to transfusion practices for TBI, we've learned about varying neural outcomes that require careful consideration. In renal colic, magnesium sulfate shows promise, but more as an adjunct to traditional methods rather than a standalone approach.
Yep, and intranasal ketamine further complicates the pain management landscape in trauma cases. It's critical for us to reflect on these studies and adapt our clinical practices accordingly to improve patient care.
Let's wrap up, Seth. I encourage all listeners to subscribe and share feedback based on their clinical experiences. Staying informed and engaged is crucial if we want to improve our patient care practices continually.
Indeed. And it's vital for us to embrace new research findings, integrating them into our daily practice to enhance patient outcomes. Until next time, everyone.